The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would have to go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him, as long and as tedious as it would be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the baroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley. Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who had heard was at one time a resident of Angels Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining there were anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a very important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius and finesse. I let him go on his way, and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. Reverend Lee. Well, there was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley, in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, and what makes me think it was one or the other, because I remember the big flume weren't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man, and always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Any way that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he's got a bet. He was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most always came out a winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned, but that feller'd offer to bet on it. And he'd take any side you please, as I was just telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he'd bet you which one would fly away first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here, and he was, too, and a good man. If he even see a straddlebug start to go anywheres, he would bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going to. And if you took him up on it, he'd follow that straddlebug to Mexico, but what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here had seen that Smiley can tell you about him. Why, if I ever made no difference to him, he'd bet on anything. The dangest feller. Parson Walker's wife lay very sick once, for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he'd come in, and Smiley up, and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerably better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that the blessing of the Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'd risk 2.5 she don't anyway. This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, you know, because, of course, she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate-like, and came converting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air and sometimes out to one side amongst the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup, that to look at him you'd think he weren't worth a cent, but to sit around and look orny and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over the shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let what he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. And then all of a sudden he would grab the other dog just by the gin of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on to it till he throwed out the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out a winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough, the money was all up, and he come to make a snatch for his pet Holt. He came in a minute how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And then he peered surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, so he got shucked up bad. He gave Smiley a look, as much to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take a hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight, and that he limped off with peace and laid down and died. It was a good pup, for that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived, for the stuff was in him, and he had genius. I know it, because he hadn't taken no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he hadn't no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of the last fight of his and the way it turned out. Well, this year, Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kinds of things, till you couldn't resist, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said if he calculated to educate him, and so he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learned that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. He gave him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, and if he got a good start, he'd come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies and keeping 'em in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see 'em. Smiley said all a frog wanted was an education, and he can do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Danny Webster down here on this floor, Danny Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker'n you can wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off in the counter there, and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to the scratching side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as he had no idea he'd been doing any more any frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it came to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it came to that, Smiley would ante up this money as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had travelled and been everywheres, all he said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little latticed box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp, he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might be you got that in that box?" And Smiley says sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it carefully, and turned it round this way and that, and says, so it is. What's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and took another long, particular look, and gave it back to Smiley and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had the experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder, so, at Daniel, and says again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I do not see no p'ints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and last says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow. and he catched Daniel by the nape of his neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds!" and turned him upside down and belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name being called from the front yard, and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just a second, set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. Well, this year Smiley had a yaller, one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, and one just a short stump like a banana, and, however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not want to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave.